Hello everyone, I am Nodejs, and today we are going to build an infinitely playable Dungeons and Dragons game. We will use React and Tailwind for our front end, Node.js for our backend, and we'll also use OpenAI's GPT API to generate endless story possibilities. This tutorial is designed to enhance your coding skills while unlocking the potential of AI in game development. So before I start to show how to code this game, let's first see the finished demo. So there is a button which says start game, and when I will click on this button, then I will be presented with the description of our game world, and we will be presented with 4 questions. So as a player, we can get to know what the game world is all about, and then we can answer these 4 questions to create our initial character. So for instance, the introduction is welcome to the world of Ethoria, a land of magic and mystery where powerful creatures roam and ancient ruins hold untold treasures, and so on and so forth. So we can select any of these options to build our character and then click on the create character button. When this will be done, then the game will begin and we will be presented with events with 4 different options. Based on our choice, the game is going to progress. So for example, if I will select this second option, then the event that will present itself is going to be based on the choice that we selected in the previous event. Alright, so now it's time to start building this game. This is Visual Studio Code, and the first thing that I will do is to create 2 folders. The first one is going to be for our React frontend, and the second one is going to be for our Node.js backend. So client folder is for the front end and server folder is for the backend. Now let's open up our terminal and create a new React application. First I will cd into the client folder and let's execute the command npx create React app and then React dnd to create our React front end. Now I will open up another terminal and over here I will cd into the server folder and execute the command npm init and then y parameter to say yes to all the default questions. Let's first start with our backend Node.js server. So I will create a new file with the name server.js. So first let me give you a brief overview of what we are going to do. In the backend, I'm going to create 2 endpoints. The first one is going to be to start our D&D game, and the second one is going to be to continue our game. For both of these endpoints, we will call the OpenAI's API, but the prompts are going to be different. So to get started with our backend code, first we need to install a bunch of dependencies, which are going to be npm install and then express and cors and OpenAI. Press enter. So in our server.js, let's first start with importing our dependencies. So const express equals to require and then express. Similarly, I am going to import cors and OpenAI as well. So cors and OpenAI is going to be require OpenAI. Alright, now let's first create our express app. So const app equals to express. Now we need to use the cors middleware to be able to call the endpoints from our React frontend because it is going to run on a different port. So app.use and cors, and we will also need to use express.json because we will be using post request for one of the endpoint. So app.use and then express.json. Now let's first create the blueprint for our 2 endpoints. So app.get, and the first one is going to be API and then dnd start, and this is going to be our callback function async request and response. So from this function we are going to return a JSON with the response. Now similar to this, we are going to create another endpoint, but this one is going to be a post endpoint because we will be providing our current game story which has happened so far in the form of the request body. So this is going to be dnd continue. Finally, let's listen on a port so that the React frontend can call our Node.js backends APIs. So let's use the port number as 5000, and for the callback function I am going to log to the console a message that server is running on port 5000. Now before we start to code our endpoints, we are going to call the OpenAI's API from both of these endpoint functions. So let's first create a common function which can then be used in both of these endpoint callback functions. Now before I continue to create this function, let me just give you a very brief overview about using OpenAI's API. So to use the API, what you have to do is you have to create an account on OpenAI and then buy credits in advance to be able to use these APIs, and you can check out the pricing on the pricing page. But the basic idea is that there is a playground which you can use to test your prompts and the API responses. You can tweak with all of these settings, primarily the model and the temperature. So we are going to use GPT 3.5 Turbo because it is fast and cheap. There are two prompts which we need to provide. The first one is going to be the system prompt and the second one is going to be the user prompt. So for system prompt, we can simply use "You are a Dungeons and Dragons game master," and for the user prompt we can set this one based on our API endpoint that is being called. I have created a dedicated video on how to do all of this, so I will share the link of that video in the description so that you guys can check that out. Alright, so let's quickly create the function async function, and the name is going to be get AI underscore response, and this function is going to accept two arguments. The first one is going to be our system prompt and the second one is going to be our user prompt. Now inside this function we have to do a bunch of things. First, we will create a new instance of OpenAI, and then we will create a messages array using the system prompt and the user prompt, and then we will call the chat completions API to get the AI's response. Now to be able to call the API, we will need an API key which can be generated in your OpenAI's dashboard. Now the proper place to store this API key is either in an environment variable or in your build workflow. But for the sake of this tutorial and to speed things up, I'm just going to paste it over here, but never hardcode your API keys. So next we are going to initialize the OpenAI instance. So OpenAI equals to new OpenAI, and then we need to provide the API key as an argument. So API key is OpenAI. Hold on, let me just copy and paste it. Next we are going to specify the AI model that we are going to use, which is going to be GPT 3.5 Turbo. Now it's time to create our messages constant. So const messages equals to a new array, and over here we are going to add both system prompt and the user prompt. For system prompt, the role is going to be system, and for user prompt the role is going to be user. So content is going to be system prompt. Now similar to this, let me just copy and paste this one. The role is going to be user and then user prompt. Right, now it's time to call our chat completions API. So const completion equals to await OpenAI dot completions. Actually it's OpenAI dot chat completions, chat dot completions, and then dot create. Now we need to provide all the options and the payload. So the model is our AI model. Next we need to provide an attribute with the name response underscore format to force the AI model to output its response in the form of JSON if we have also specified that in our prompt. So the value is going to be an object, and this object is going to have a property with the name type and with the value JSON underscore object. Next we can simply add the messages to the payload as well. Now to get the AI model's output, what we can do is we can simply create a new const with the name AI response, and this is going to fetch the value from the completion object. So completion.choices arrays first item dot message dot content. So from this property we can get the actual response that we need, and we don't need anything else from this completion object. Next we can simply return the JSON by parsing it. So hold on, return JSON dot parse and then AI response. That is pretty much everything we need to do for this function. Now let me just collapse it, and we can then use it in first our dnd start endpoint. So with dnd start we can simply call this function. So const AI response equals to await get AI underscore response. Now first we need to provide a system prompt. The system prompt that we are going to use is going to be this one: you are a Dungeons and Dragons game master. Then we need to provide a user prompt, and the user prompt is going to be this one: describe the game world and generate 4 questions, each with 4 options to set up the player character. Use JSON format, and this is the JSON format in which we want this AI model to return the output. So there is a property world description and then the character questions. Now we are going to use these 2 properties in our React frontend. So finally just return the AI response as the response JSON. Now I'm not going to implement dnd continue endpoint for now. First let's just implement this dnd start in our React frontend. So let's open up our client folder, and in the src folder I will create a new folder with the name components, and then another folder with the name game, and then inside this game folder I will create a file index.jsx. Okay, I will use a shortcut to create the component boilerplate, and then let's just call it game. Now in React we are going to use Axios to call the API endpoint. So first let's just cd into the project folder and then npm install and Axios. Alright, first let's just import Axios. So import Axios from Axios. Now inside our game component we need to first create a bunch of state values. So the first one is going to indicate if the game has been started or not. This can be simply called as game started. So game started has initial value of false. Next we need to know if the user has created their character or not. Based on that we will then proceed to continue the game and fetch individual game events. This can be called as character created. Let's create another state property which is going to be called as is loading. Now is loading is false initially, but whenever we will invoke or raise any API request, then we are going to set it to true so that we can indicate helpful loading message on the game user interface. There is one more thing that I just remembered I need to do, and that is to install Tailwind CSS for this project. So I will be doing that in the background. Alright, so after installing Tailwind, let's continue with our component. So first I will create a wrapper div which is going to be styled with Tailwind's utility classes. Now I'm not going to focus too much on how to style any of the HTML elements, but you can review this code later to get to know what utility classes I have used for any of the elements. So this is going to be our parent div. Let me just zoom out a little bit so that you guys can see more code on this screen. First we will simply check the condition for is loading. If loading is true, then we will return a div, otherwise we will return otherwise we are going to return another div. Okay, so when the loading is true, then we can simply return a message which is going to say loading, and we are also going to style it appropriately. If loading is false, then we need to check another condition, and that is if game has started or not. If game has not started, then we will display a button for the user to be able to click to start the game. So if game is not started, let me just enclose this inside curly brackets. So if game is not started, then we are going to return a div with a button, otherwise we are going to return another div which will then be used to check further conditions. Alright, so if game is not started, then we can display a button which is simply going to say start game, and this button's on click event is just going to set the game started state to true. So on click equals to set game started true. Let's style this button as well using Tailwind. Now we have created our button to start the game, but when the game will be started, then we have to first check if the character has been created or not. If the character is not created, then we will call our DND start API endpoint to get the AI model's response to create the character. But if the character is created, then we will return another UI which is going to display game events, and the user can select any of the 4 choices to progress in the game. So in this div, let me just style it first using Tailwind, and let's just format this code once. We will check if the character is created or not. So if character is not created, then we will display a bunch of HTML elements. Otherwise, we are going to display the game events div. Now before we continue from over here, let's just create another state value which is going to be called as a game state. So game state is going to be initialized with 2 properties, character questions array and the world description. Let's see what the response for DND start endpoint is going to be. So I'm just going to run our backend server first. So node server, and let's open up our browser and localhost port 5000 and then API and then DND start. So this is the response that we are getting. This is our world description property, and this is our character questions, which is an array with 4 objects. Each object has a question text property and an options property, which is another array with the 4 options for the user to select. Now using this JSON, what we can do is we can initialize our game state using character questions and world description as default values. Next, we can use a use effect hook, and we can provide a callback function which is going to be called whenever our first the game started property is changed or our character created is changed. So inside this callback function, we can add the condition if game has been started but the character is not created, then we can initialize our game state. So first we can set is loading to true, and then we can use axios.get to call the endpoint. So the endpoint URL is going to be this one. So I'm just going to copy from over here and then paste it. So let's change the then function callback. So then, and then we will get the response as an argument, and we can set the game state using the response data. So set game state, and the value is going to be response dot data. Okay, so now when we have got the response, then let's store the default character info somewhere, because that is what we will be going to use in the subsequent game events. So for that, I will create another state value which is going to be called as character info. So let's first set up default character info by simply iterating over response.data.character questions. So response.data.character questions.map, and for each question we can return individual objects for default answer selections. So question is simply going to be question and question underscore text, and the answer is going to be our options first item. So question.options and then the value at the 0th index. Alright, next let's just call set character info, and then I'm going to provide this default character info as an argument. And finally, when this is done, then we can set the is loading to false. Let's also add a catch callback as well. If something goes wrong, then again we have to set the is loading state to false. Alright, so now we can use this character info state value in our JSX that we are returning when the character is not created. So first I'm just going to print an h2 element which will say game introduction. Then we can print the world description. by simply accessing world description property from our game state. Next, we can print another title, which is going to say to create your character. Now to create our character, we can create a form, and inside this form we can have the forms on submit event. So on submit, this is simply going to call a function. So first this is going to call e.prevent default because this is the on submit event. Then we can simply set character created to true, because when the user is done, then we will simply have to set this state to true so that the next game events can be fetched. So inside this form we are just going to display 4 select inputs for each of the question answer. So this can be done by simply iterating over game state dot character underscore questions dot map, and for the callback function we are going to add the arguments for the question and the index. So this is going to return a div. The div's key is going to be index, and first we are going to add a label, and the label is going to be question underscore text. And then hold on, let me just close this parenthesis. Alright, next we are going to add a select element, and we will iterate over the question options to add individual options. So hold on, question dot options dot map, and this is again going to have the option and the, let's call it idx because we are already using index. So not this one. We are going to return individual options, and the option value is going to be our option. Now for each of these options the key is going to be idx, and the value is going to be the option itself. Now we need to add the on change event for our select input, and for that I will create a function which is going to be called as handle input change. So const handle input change equals to a function with the arguments index and the value. So this is going to update the character info state. So set character info. Now I'm going to provide a callback function to update the state. So we are going to use the previous value, so we will map over it. So previous dot map. Now inside this maps callback function, what we are going to do is we will simply update the object or the item at this particular index, and the answer is going to be this value. So info, and then I is going to be the index, and if I equals to index, then we are going to return all the existing properties, and the answer, hold on, answer is going to be the value. Otherwise we are going to just return the existing info object. Alright, now let's use this handle input change in our select input. So on change is going to call a function handle input change. We will send in the current index and e.target.value, which is the current selected option by the user. Now finally let's add the submit button for our form, and for that I'm just going to add a button, and the button text is going to be create character. For this button the type is going to be submit. Now for all of these HTML elements I am going to quickly add the missing Tailwind CSS utility classes. Alright, now it's time to move on to our game events section. So when the character is going to be created, then we need to display the user the game events which the user can use to progress into the game, and for that we need to add some more state variables. The first one is going to be the story so far, which we are going to use to track the story which has been played by the user so far. Next, let's also add another state value which is going to be called as current event. So the current event is going to have two properties, the next event and the available choices. Now I'm not seeing our is loading state value over here. I remember adding it. Maybe I have yep, I have just pressed enter and it's over here. Let's just move it up here as well to keep the consistency. Okay, so before we go ahead and implement our game events, we need to make the changes to our server.js file to implement our dnd continue endpoint. So our dnd continue endpoint is first going to read the values for the vault description, the character and the story so far from request.body. Then we are going to create an array for the user prompt. Now in this user prompt, first we are going to push the textual prompt, which is going to be this one. Based on these stories so far and my choices, generate a new game event with 4 set of choices available for me and start the story if it has not started yet. Next we need to push to this array these 3 values: world description, character and story so far. So you can push the request.body directly as well, but ideally you should be validating these 3 values, so it's better to deconstruct them first. Let's push another prompt which is going to be called as use this JSON format for output, and then we have to provide the JSON format. Next we are going to call the get AI response function to get the response from the AI model, and the system prompt is going to be this one: you are a Dungeons and Dragons game master, continue the game based on my previous choices. And then we are just joining the prompt by using pipe as a separator, and then finally we can simply return the AI response as the JSON value from this endpoint as a response. So let's just format this document as well. Now I am first going to stop the server and start it again because I have changed our endpoint logic. Let's get back to our React code again. Now we are going to update this use effect hooks callback function. So when game is started but character is not created, then we are calling the dnd start API. But if the game has started and character is also created, then we are going to call the next endpoint for continuing our game. So if game started and character created, so for this I'm just going to create another function because we need to use it elsewhere as well. So const get next event equals to a function. So first same thing, let's just set is loading to true, and then instead of get we are going to call post because this is a post request. So axios.post, and then the URL is going to be this one up to API, but we need to use dnd continue. Now for the post requests payload, we need to provide vault description and the character and the story so far. So I'm just going to add those properties over here. Next we can change the then callback, and this curly bracket is not going to be here. So for the then callback, let's add the response argument. So when we will get the response, then we can first update the current event state with response data, and let's also set the is loading to false. Let's also add a catch callback as well. Now we can use this get next event function over here after the character is created. So when the character is going to be created, then the current event state is going to be set, which simply means that we can use it to display the UI, the current event UI in our JSX. So first I'm just going to print the entire next event that we have fetched, and then for the options I'm going to first create a div, and then we can iterate over the available choices in the current event. So available choices dot map, and the callback function is going to have the argument for each choice within each iteration. So let's return a button, a clickable button for each choice, and the button text is going to be choice. And for the buttons on click event, let's add another function which is going to be called as make choice. So const make choice equals to an arrow function with choice as an argument, and over here we can simply update our story so far state value. So because this is going to be an array, we can first spread out the existing story so far. Hold on, it's going to be a story so far, and then we can add a new object for the user's selection. So the event is going to be current event dot next underscore event, and the user's choice, which is going to be indicated by the property name my choice, is going to be the this choice argument. Now let's use this make choice down here for each of the choice button. So on click equals to make choice, and let's add all the missing Tailwind classes as well. Alright, so I think we are done writing all the JSX that we are going to need to handle all the different game states. Now I'm just going to format this document once. Now there is one last thing that we need to do is when the story so far is updated, then we need to again call the get next event function to either start the game or get the next event in the game. So for that I'm going to add the story so far dependency in our use effect. So a story so far, and then in this else if condition what we can do is we can add the or statement. So or if story so far is updated and its length is not 0, then also we have to call the get next event function. I think this is everything we need to do for our game component. Next I am going to open up app.js file, and let's remove all this default stuff and import our game component, and I'm going to return this game component from app component. And let's open up the terminal and start our React application. So npm start. So it says use state is not defined within the game component. So I don't know why the VS Code editor has not imported it automatically, but let's import it ourselves manually. Alright, now there is a bunch of text content rendered, so I think something is wrong with how we are returning the JSX, and also it doesn't look like the Tailwind CSS is being applied. So let's fix these issues one by one. First I'm going to check out the Tailwind's config, what's wrong with it. So okay, so we need to add JSX over here as well, and for our game component let's check the JSX that we are returning. Okay, so this is not an expression, so I think this is because we are returning it as a child of this div directly. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete this parent div, and let's format this code. Yeah, now I think this should be working. Alright, so now there is the start game button. Let's click on it. Okay, so we are getting the initial game state. The game world is a vast continent called Throsia, and so on and so forth. Now these are all the questions to create the game character, and I'm just going to select random ones, what skill, combat, and we are curious, etc. Let's now click on the create character button. Alright, so this is the first event in the story. As you journey through the bustling city of Throsia, you come across a mysterious old man and so on, and then we can click on any of these 4 choices that the game has presented us. So I'm just going to click on this second button. Now the game should proceed and it should give us the next event. Okay, so as you decide to decline the old man's offer. Alright, so it looks like our game is progressing correctly. Based on our choices, we are being presented the next event by the AI model, and this is right now kind of an infinitely playable Dungeons and Dragons game, but you can easily modify it to add some kind of end condition or winning condition after let's say a few events, or maybe you can ask the AI model to draft the chapters of the story, and then based on those chapters you can present the events to the user. I mean, it really depends on you how you want to implement this game in your own way, but as a starting point I think this should be enough to get you started. If this content was helpful to you, then please consider subscribing this channel. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.